Greetings and welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. I'm very excited about our program this week. This is something very different for me personally. As you all know, a lot of times I'll just do a solo show, go up there, or when I do have interviews with interesting guests, it's usually more straightforward UFO, UAP conversation. But I like to stretch things a little bit. I like to try some new ideas and to particularly interact with people who are just plain fascinating, interesting, who are themselves pushing the borders of their own area of expertise. And my guest today, Anthony Peake, is absolutely one of these people. Uh, Before I bring Anthony on for conversation, you can see him right there. He's just a very, very unusual, interesting scholar. He's an acclaimed author, I think, of something like 11 or a dozen books. He's a researcher. He's delved into, I guess we can call them the borderline areas of human consciousness. He can correct me if I haven't characterized that properly. Uh, but he's not like there are researchers and then there are researchers. Anthony is serious. He is fact-driven. He has attended the London School of Economics. He has been focusing his whole adult professional career on the mysteries of the human mind. He's had books such as Is There a Life After Death? And another on Cheating the Ferryman, which is a great hypothesis and a great concept. He knows a lot about Aldous Huxley, and he's talked about opening the doors of perception and a lot with NDEs and consciousness and psychedelics, and yes, aliens, and yes, abductions and UFOs and everything else. He's in a lot of interesting places. So I think we've got a great concept, a series of concepts to discuss today. Anthony, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Richard. What an introduction. I just hope that I can actually fulfill the anticipation now of after that wonderful
Well,
eulogy that you started with. So, yes, no,
well,
absolutely.
you're quite welcome. I'll just add that you and I got to know about each other, I think through my wife, Tracy, it was a year ago that you and Tracy did a panel together at the Contact in the Desert event in 2023. You were great, by the way. I attended that. I was very interested in your ideas. And we started chatting, and you and Tracy and myself. You were gracious enough to do an event hosted by Tracy a couple of months ago, earlier this year, which was really very positive, and you were wonderful there. So I've been wanting to have you on in a more public venue ever since. So I'm glad and grateful to have you here. So with all of that out of the way, you have a concept, you've got some interesting ideas that challenge me. But I would just throw the ball back at you and ask you, what are you up to these days? What are you into? And how about we just start from there?
Okay, well, I suppose in saying what am I into, I suppose the argument is literally anything and everything. People who know me consider I have an incredibly eclectic mind, and I don't take anything out of the equation. So therefore, when I'm researching a particular subject area, I will go as deep as I possibly can into the subject and as broadly as I possibly can. I mean, for instance, over the last year or so, I've been wrestling with the mathematics behind quantum mechanics, because effectively I've argued that it's all well and good talking about quantum mechanics and the concepts, but until you can actually appreciate why certain belief systems and why they come to certain conclusions, the only way you can do that is to actually understand how they and why they've come to those conclusions. And it's a veritable rabbit hole, because you end up following. I have a concept called the Daemon and Eidolon dyad, which is the idea that, for want of a better term, you consider it to be a higher self. But I argue that we are guided through life by another element of ourselves. And I sometimes believe that I'm guided by whatever that is to follow certain routes. And sometimes I will be given little clues that I need to follow down certain pathways,
Yeah.
down the labyrinth. And this is what I do. So at the moment, I've just finished a book that I wanted to write for many, many years on near-death experiences. And I'm delighted that, funnily enough, the person who wrote the foreword for that book is Dr. Pascal Michael. And Pascal is one of the leading up-and-coming researchers into alien encounters facilitated by dimethyltryptamine. He's a young academic, and he will be at Breaking Contact in the Desert, by the way, as well, and he'll be speaking there. And the areas that I've found from there, alone has been so useful. So near-death experiences, the similarities between near-death experiences and alien abductions also fascinates me. The similarities between near-death experiences and out-of-the-body experiences, I believe they're all linked. And I think at a lower level of information, they are all effectively facets of the same phenomenon.
If I could just jump in, I get a very strong sense of really what we're getting into at fundamental level is a concept of reality, which really I think we must address here. So there's a fundamental concept of reality that some people will have, which is, let's just call it straight up materialist idea, in which consciousness does not inhabit the grander this reality within which we find ourselves. And then there's, of course, a whole other school of thought. I've gone back and forth here between these ideas my whole life, Anthony. This is the truth. But this other concept by which there's relationship to space, time, there's a relationship to consciousness, and the whole question of who's driving the car? What is this reality within which we find ourselves? And this is, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, fundamentally where you are finding your endless fascination is in exploring this very question. I mean, it must deal with things like causality and the influence of the understanding of what is consciousness itself. And you have a concept called egregorial, I believe. And
Yes.
and I know that this is important in the whole broader context of what interests you. And perhaps you can discuss that in context of everything else. And I don't want to derail you. So if I'm going down a path that's not really proper, I would love for you just to correct me. And
no, I'm more than happy. I think
we're talking about reality here. We're talking about a fundamental conception of reality that you have.
Well, I think just even using the grammar I just used, I think, we use that term all the time. But what is the I that's doing the thinking? What is consciousness, and what is the concept of personality? What is the concept of continuality in terms of our own lives and our own perceptions? And indeed, the huge question, and I think it was in 1995, a young Australian academic called David Chalmers stood up at the University of Arizona. They have an annual event on consciousness. And he turned around and challenged the audience, and he said that at the present moment in time, we have the easy problem of the brain and consciousness, which is how the brain functions, how neurotransmitters work, and everything else. We've got that fairly well put about. But the major question is not that. The question is, how does inanimate matter, which effectively, as I said in my last book, which is when it comes down to it, it's electrons reacting with quarks within the brain, create Richard, create Anthony, your hopes, your fears, your dreams. There is something here that magical happens, that suddenly, spontaneously, seemingly out of nowhere, consciousness appears. Now, they would argue, or the materialist reductionists argue that, or no, the eliminative materialists like Daniel Dennett, which is more of an accurate, they argue that literally we are fooling ourselves into thinking we're even conscious. We are being fooled. In other words, but we think we are. Now, that is an extraordinary thing to believe, because in order to be fooled, you have to be aware of things. A magician, when they do a magical trick, it's an illusion they create that the person's being tricked, but the person has to be consciously aware of the fact and perceiving the trick to be fooled. So how on earth something that is non-conscious can be fooled about anything is extraordinary.
That's a really good way to look at it.
And although Daniel Dennett, who died recently, he wrote a fantastic book, a very hubristic book called Consciousness Explained, which he doesn't explain at all. He has all these kind of plates of hand to argue it. But the thing is that consciousness is something that seems to be everywhere. We are all consciously aware. We are now interfacing. Our consciousness is now aware, and we are consciously interfacing with each other. The people that will be listening to this and watching this interview and this discussion are similar consciousnesses that will all be reacting to the things we are saying. And I argue that when consciousnesses get together in a collective form, where they start getting into the zone, what happens is you get what's called the third man factor, whereby there's something greater that encases people when people get excited and talk like this. And I call that particular concept the egregorial. And I called it that because it seems that the collective consciousness is greater than individual consciousnesses. And I'll give an example of this, of just how curious this can be. Way back, I think it was in 1970 or 71, there was a series of experiments done in Toronto, in Canada, whereby a group of researchers created an entity, which they called Richard Aylesford. What happened was they were quite fascinated by Ouija boards, and they were quite fascinated by when you use a Ouija board, you are unconsciously moving the glass, supposedly.
Right.
But when you get sentient messages, how is it that the messages seem to work? So what they thought was, are we collectively creating something greater than ourselves? So what they did was they literally created a fictional character called Richard Aylesford. They argued that Richard Aylesford was a British noble, English noble living in the English Midlands just after the English Civil War. He was a Roman Catholic, therefore he was outside of society. He falls in love with a gypsy girl. His wife finds out, and he kills himself by throwing
All of
himself.
this is a fictitious creation of this
But it was
group.
completely fictitious. This never happened. What the only thing that was correct was the location of the castle. Otherwise, it was fictional. Yeah. But the entity started manifesting itself. They started actually making contact with Richard Aylesford, and Richard Aylesford started manifesting really strange things like table turning and everything else. In fact, if anybody's interested, if you go online, you will actually see an interview they did on TV in Toronto, live television, and there's table turning. The table is moving around the studio. Now, the argument is, what were they creating here? And I'd argue what they're creating is something known as a tulpa. Tulpas are thought forms that are very much part of the Buddhist Bon tradition of Tibet. And the idea is that if you concentrate hard enough, you can bring these things into reality. You can manipulate reality and bring them into reality.
Bring them in, but also it sounds like create them.
And create them, or they use, and this is the interesting thing, or they use your anticipation of them to come through. In other words, it's almost like bootstraps. One thing is creating the other. And this is because I argue that consciousness is prime. Consciousness is what is everything. The physical reality we see around us is actually consciously created by us collectively. And the quantum mechanics of this is powerful. There's something called a twin slit experiment, which I won't have time to go into detail in, but I will be going into great detail when I do my Physics 101 on the Thursday before the Contact in the Desert. And they've known effectively since 1925 that there's a direct relationship between the observer or the act of measurement and physical reality. Now, to the extent that subatomic particles come into existence at the act of observation, before they are observed or measured, they literally exist as a statistical function, a mathematical function, the function of whether a subatomic particle will be in a particular location or another. But until they are measured, the subatomic particle is literally a wave function. And when it is observed or measured, it collapses. Literally, it's called collapsing the wave function into a point particle in a particular location. Now, the mystery here is that these subatomic particles, such as quarks and electrons and photons, these are the building blocks of physical reality. Without these objects, these ephemeral objects, that don't have any real, genuine existence. Without that, there's no reality. Now, again, for instance, I argue and I say to people, when you think there's physical reality out there and you think there's a one-to-one relationship between what is out there and what you perceive, the term used by consciousness studies people is naive realism. Somebody who believes there's a one-to-one relationship between what you see and what is really out there are naive realists, because they know that the way the brain functions doesn't work that way. What you think is external reality is a model that is created by the visual cortex right in the darkest part of the brain from information that is being given to it by the optic nerve, by the retina, and everything else. And it creates from that information field something. Now, again, when you look around you now,
Yeah.
everything you see is being created on information of photons hitting the back of the eye, the retina. And the retina creates an image which is postage stamp sized and inverted. And the visual cortex in the darkest part of the brain takes that data and information, and from an inverted image that's postage stamped and upside down, they create this whole three-dimensional surround world that we perceive.
Now, let me ask you. I'm sorry. Let me ask you. This is fascinating. You explain this really well, by the way. But if we're creating this reality from our own connections, cognition, our somehow how our consciousness interacts with the fundamental particles of reality, which is what I'm thinking you're saying, don't we still have to correspond with an external reality well enough, or we'll die? Like, we live in an environment. And so whatever it is we're creating, doesn't it have to conform to a great extent with a larger, can I say, physical reality? Or am I wrong here?
I mean, the argument is there is something out there. There's no doubt there is something out there, because we interface with it and we react to it, and we need it. We need the air to breathe, these kind of things.
Yeah.
But the fact that we think, for instance, I use the argument, the color red. I have a term I use, which I call electromagnetic chauvinism. And by this, I mean that we assume that what we see is real. And I use the argument of the way in which we see color. Now, the way we see color is literally because photons of light, and photons themselves are a mystery, because photons have zero mass, so they have no extension in space, and can only ever travel at the speed of light.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that for a second. At the speed of light,
no mass.
Stops.
Yeah.
No mass, and time stops. And these are the little things that make us see things. Now, on top of that, these little tiny things sometimes are a wave and sometimes are a particle. Yeah. And it depends on whether they are observed, whether they're a wave or particle or not. So this is when we start getting it really weird. And then I say, right, okay, so red is literally, when we see red, it's because a certain vibrationary state of the electromagnetic spectrum and a certain vibrationary state we interpret as being the color red.
Yeah.
But there's no red out there. Now, we then say, okay, well, what are we perceiving? Well, let's use an analogy here. The electromagnetic spectrum, effectively, which is light, visible light is the part we can see, runs from gamma radio waves to gamma rays. Now, imagine the electromagnetic spectrum is like a long line. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I say, that long line, imagine it's the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River starts in a small lake in Minnesota and travels down the center of the states down to the Gulf of Mexico. If the equivalent size of that, what we think is the visual world with all its color and light and everything else, is 1.5 inches, about 8 miles south of Hannibal, Missouri. Okay. And that's it. And that's it. So we believe that that is everything that there is. Now, we know, for instance, there was a very famous academic article written many years ago called What It's Like to Be a Bat. And, you have to think, well, a bat sees by sending out sound and builds up a picture of the external world from how sound bounces back. So their perception of reality is completely different. But there's no special perception of reality that we have that bats don't. Bats would argue that our worldview is far more, is just as real. So it's how we understand reality is out there. Now, on top of that, there is more and more research being done at the moment suggesting that the external reality we perceive out there, whatever it may be, where it's made up of quarks, because effectively the whole of everything we perceive is literally made up of 6 quarks reacting in electromagnetic fields with photons and various things. That's all there is, 6 quarks. And quarks are so, nobody's ever seen a quark. They are incredibly tiny. So clearly there is something really strange going on here. Now, it seems from the research that's been going on in recent years is that everything effectively is data. Everything is mathematical. Everything we perceive, we are processing data in exactly the same way that your laptop processes data to create the 3-dimensional world when you put on a virtual reality headset. There is no difference. Now, I then argue to people, and people say, well, you know, reality is consistent and reality is out there. Well, I'll guarantee that if I put a VR headset on your head, and then you had tactile feedback from your hands, so you could actually move within 3-dimensional reality, and then I wiped all your previous memories clear of the fact that you are living in this reality, that simulated reality would be just as real. And indeed, we go into a brain-created simulated reality every night when we dream. Sure. Now, that reality is just as real. It's just as tangent. It's just as tangible. It is just as perceptive. And the only reason that we believe that is an hallucination is purely and simply because we don't share it. We don't share it with other people. But I have evidence of people I know that in out-of-body experiences have had shared experiences.
So sure, and you know, you hear people talking about their ayahuasca experiences, which, by the way, I've never done hallucinogens, but this is something that you study. And I am aware that there's an entire array of conversations among people in those communities, the DMT community, about these shared visions, correct? I mean, that's a huge element of conversation.
Massively. I mean, funnily enough, again, Pascal is one of the major researchers in this area, together with 1 or 2 other people that I've done conferences with in the past. And some of the research they're doing at the moment at Imperial College in London, and also the research that's being done at the University of Sussex, quite close to where I live here, they're finding out some extraordinary things. In fact, what they're finding out, for example, psilocybin, you know, magic mushrooms. Yeah. They did a series of experiments where they rigged people to fMRI scans and everything else to find out what was happening in the brain when somebody starts hallucinating using psilocybin. And what they were expecting to discover was that it made the brain link more. You know, the different areas of the brain would light up and link. Psilocybin does the opposite. It switches the brain off. It stops the brain being effective, which meets the conclusion coming back to Aldous Huxley in this. Coming back to Aldous Huxley's argument that the brain is an attenuator. The brain is there to take information out, not put information in.
And it takes it out from out there somehow.
Yeah. In other words, again, you know, I leap from subject to subject here, so my apologies. But I've been doing one of my books. I did a lot of research in autism, and of course, what is autism? Autism is when somebody. I have a term with my book, Opening the Doors of Perception. I have something I call the Huxleyan spectrum, and the Huxleyan spectrum is effectively that we all human beings, we all have perceptual fields where our senses tell us things. But some people have broader perceptual fields, like people when they acquire autism, people when they acquire temporal lobe epilepsy, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's disease, all these things. What they do is they stop the brain's ability to stop the signals coming in. Indeed, for instance, we know from autism.
Forgive me, but to stop what signals from coming in? I'm not sure I'm following
the overall signal field that is available to us is far, far greater. As I said before, you know, with the analogy of
okay.
It's much greater, but it's greater in so many different ways. There are perceptual fields that we just cannot see or hear, but it doesn't mean they're not there. And what happens is that with individuals, for instance, with Alzheimer's, we know that with Alzheimer's, what takes place is that the neurons of the brain are effectively destroyed by things called amyloid plaques. These are things that literally explode the neurons and stops the neurons being effective.
Yeah.
But I argue that by doing that, they literally stop the neurons' abilities to attenuate the reality that's coming in. So when somebody like my own mother, she started experiencing the most phenomenal things. I have friends of mine who have Charles Bonnet syndrome, whereby they see entities everywhere. And it's again because of the constructs of their brain and how their brain are constructing things. They're seeing things. It doesn't mean these things aren't real. It's just we can't see them.
When you say attenuate, could another word be filter? That's what it sounds
Yeah.
like to me. Where they're
Well,
filtering
it's
out.
again, the word attenuate goes back
Yeah.
from to people like Henri Bergson, C.D.
Yeah.
Broad.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a philosophical concept, and Bergson was arguing this 120 years ago. But the idea is that
Really? That's Bergson? I don't think I
pardon?
knew that about Henri Bergson, that was
Oh
his
yeah.
concept.
Oh, totally. His work was absolutely fascinating. He was so
Oh,
far advanced Bergson, and he
fascinating.
was.
I'll have to check that out. So this is very interesting. So what you're suggesting, and I'm sure there are other people who are kind of in this school of thought. This is
Oh
fascinating,
yeah.
Anthony, is that these things that we are inclined to call disorders, whether it's schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, autism, that essentially it sounds like what you're saying is they essentially alter our perception and our filter of what is actually always there, but which now can break through more
Mm.
than ordinarily. Is that
That is absolutely it. Now,
that's
for
it? Okay.
instance, last year at Contact in the Desert, one of the people that came to see me was a guy called Myron Dial. And Myron Dial is an extremely talented LA-based artist. His art is just extraordinary. And he has temporal lobe epilepsy. And he has had temporal lobe epilepsy or perceived temporal lobe epilepsy since he was about 6 years of age. And all his art is influenced by his TLA. And he has the most extraordinary experiences. He goes to another place called Zelcon. And in Zelcon, he has an alternative personality, which I would argue is his daemon, which is his spirit guide, which is called Charon.
I'm going to come back to the idea of a daemon, but we'll put a pin in that to keep going.
So he's told me that he perceives the world in completely different ways. And I know people. I'm a classic migrainer, and I know when I'm in aura state before I have a migraine. I see the world differently. I see colors differently. I see things out there. I see scotomas. I see zigzag patterns that are not physically out there, but they might as well be as far as I'm concerned. So what is taking place here? And is it that depending on how we are attuned to the reality around us is how our reality is molded? So in which case, what is this reality really made of? And the arguments going forward is it is literally made out of data. It is literally, and it is to do again with black holes. It's to do with entropy. It is to, I mean, for instance, there's been research done now at the Perimeter Institute in Ontario. There's a guy called Craig Hogan and his team. They're looking for the pixelation of space.
Hold that thought. The pixelation of space.
Pixelation of space. Because we know that space is not continual. We know from quantum mechanics. That's what the word.
This is the same concept of a quanta, correct? Like you break reality into these tiny but somewhat indivisible bits at the smallest level. Is
Correct.
this what you mean by?
Yeah, because the term quanta is Latin for package.
Yeah. Okay.
And effectively, when in 1901 Max Planck stood up and made his famous speech in December 1900, when he presented his quanta theory, that's what he argued, was that energy is not continual. Energy comes in tiny packets, which explains a lot of the problems they had with black body radiation and other things they had in the 1890s. And they solved that, but in doing so, they suddenly realized that physical reality is not continual. It doesn't flow. It's in discrete bits.
Yes.
Now, the argument is David Finkelstein, who's a physicist many years ago, he said, well, why isn't time quantized as well? So if time is quantized, that means there's one moment here and one moment there. So what is between You know, when you pointed, I wrote a book called the Labyrinth of Time a few years ago, and I'll be doing a talk on time.
Mhm.
So the idea is that it is the act of observation that actually takes the discrete bits and pulls them together into a flow. Okay, it's
Like
what,
a movie,
yeah,
in frame by
exactly.
frame by frame.
It's what the great David Bohm, Professor David Bohm, quantum physicist, argued. It's called the hollow movement. And again, all these people I'm quoting, David Bohm was considered to be, I mean, David Bohm worked with Einstein, and he was trying to understand why certain quantum physics effects happen. And he supported Einstein. Einstein argued that quantum mechanics, or the Copenhagen interpretation, which is the standard model of quantum mechanics, it doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't, because effectively there are two types of science at the moment. There's effectively quantum mechanics, which have certain calculations they use and certain formulae. Then you have cosmology, the very, very big. Mathematically, they don't work together. If you plug in the formulae for quantum mechanics and plug in the formulae for cosmology, you get infinities. It doesn't work. So seemingly, as Einstein said, at a deeper level of reality, it all comes together, but we're not there yet. So what we're doing, we're almost like seeing the tips of icebergs, and we're calculating this because that works for the very small, and that works for the very large. And what Bohm said was that at a deeper level, there's something called the implicate order. And the implicate order is where quantum mechanics and cosmology come together. So Einstein's work and Niels Bohr's work, and it comes together. But it all comes down to data. It all comes down to information. It all comes down to information processing. And it's only these days now that we are now, because we are aware of the power. And with AI, this is going to make it even more intriguing. So when we start applying AI to virtual reality and VR, we're going to get some amazing things, because we're going to be able to model the most amazing things. Now, posit that thought for a second, that we could model virtual realities and we could model a planet or a universe made out of the information we have. Could they have already done that? And this is what we're in. We're in a
This is simulation theory.
correct.
You're
It's
taking us right in there.
the argument is that we exist within a simulation. I mean, Lee Smolin, various other people have come up with this idea, and it makes rational sense. And of course, if we can discover, if Craig Hogan and his associates can find the pixelation of space, we're on our way. We're suddenly finding,
Well, sim theory is one of these things where it's fascinating. I don't know how to disprove it. Like it's a very, I don't know if it's properly falsifiable, but that doesn't mean it isn't true. There's a lot of logic to it. I have to concede as well. I say concede because I don't want to believe in sim theory. I don't want to have this. I don't like the idea that we are existing as the simulation. But when you really think about it, how is that radically different from an ancient philosopher stating that we are thoughts in the mind of God?
exactly.
How is it any different from that, really, when you get down to it?
Exactly. In my new book, I have a whole section on Vedanta. And the idea in Vedanta, for instance, the Indian philosophy argues that we're all effectively in the dream of Brahman.
Yeah.
And of course, the argument is that I'm also fascinated by a concept called pandeism, and the idea that everything is a great thought. And again, Sir Julian Jaynes, who was a big British...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Anthony. Pandeism. So essentially, God is everywhere. Is that essentially what you mean?
Everything is God. God is an information field.
Yeah. Okay.
And we are emanations of that information field. And again, the latest research that's been done in the holographic argument seems to suggest that there are levels of consciousness, and we're functioning at a particular level. Now, in my new book, I mean, I can never prove this, but I have the concept of the Eidolon, which is a singular consciousness that exists for one life and then dies. Then we have a daemon, which is the consciousness above that, which lives multiple lives and uses that information to feed into the Eidolon, how the Eidolon behaves within this environment. It's like your game player. Imagine that we are existing in a virtual reality VR version of your life, where every outcome of every decision you can make is already programmed into the game.
Yes.
So you live your life the first time, and then you get to the end of that life and you die, just like an on-screen sprite when you play a computer game. It lives just once, and it, like for instance, Lara Croft, start Tomb Raider, Lara Croft pops up, it's an Eidolon on screen. The game player takes Lara Croft down into a room and a monster eats her. She's dead. He starts the game again. Suddenly, the game player has lived one life and has information he didn't have before, or she didn't have before,
Right.
which she can then manipulate the new Lara Croft to not go into that room. Now, I argue this is what happens in life, because I'm sure you have had that experience, and I know so many other people have had that experience. You meet somebody, I know this person, I know they're
Sure.
going to be important to me. Where does that come from? I argue it comes from the daemon. I argue that your game player gives you information. And I also argue that the communication field between the daemon and the eidolon depends on how far along the Huxleyan spectrum you are, how open your doors of perception are. So, for instance, my friend Myron Dial, who has temporal lobe epilepsy, his daemon is imminent in his life because the communication channels, his doors of perception are more open. So,
I would like to add, I mean, the idea of Daemon, I've read about this ages ago because this is what Socrates talked about.
yeah.
That was his inspiration, and that he was guided by this. Would you say that the Daemon is, maybe this is what I thought that I understood from you. The Daemon is essentially us, but from a different time. Is it a timeless version of
Effectively,
us?
yeah. It's a version of you that will live all your lives and remember
Yeah,
them,
that's
like
right.
like a game player. Now, I then argue that, and I cannot prove this, whereas the Daemon Eidolon stuff, I do the neurology of this. I do information from split brain operations, for example. So there is powerful evidence of this. I mean, you were talking earlier on about the way in which anthropology developed and paleoanthropology.
It was
I
before we
presume,
began recording, and I wouldn't mind coming back to that, but yeah,
okay,
continue.
but you
Yeah.
must be aware of the writings of Julian Jaynes and his bicameral mind concept.
Yes, vaguely. Yes,
Okay.
vaguely.
So Jaynes argues, that there is the voice in your head that
Yeah.
I argue is, again, the daemon. But I argue that what may be above that, there may be something greater than the daemon behind the daemon. And I call that the uber daemon. And the uber daemon is my equivalent of the Jungian collective unconscious.
Okay.
It is effectively the daemon of all humanity. And I argue this is why, for instance, when people have hypnotic regression and go back to other lives and previous lives, they're not going back to a previous life they have lived. They are attuning into a huge field of information that contains all of everything. So therefore, you go in and
Right.
suddenly you're attuned and you're being a 14th century French peasant.
That's right.
Now, again, there's a couple of friends of mine who are professional stage hypnotists who do hypnotic regressions, and they are
Yes.
convinced that my argument is correct. They believe you attune into, and of course, this is the Akashic field,
Yeah. Yeah.
the Akashic record. Now,
Exactly.
again, but I'm not using the Akashic field in its terminology that is used by, I think, people like Blavatsky. I'm using the Akashic field in the way it's used by people like Irvin Laszlo. I wrote a book with a Professor Irvin Laszlo a few years ago. I don't know if you know, Laszlo's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and he's an
Hmm.
interesting, very interesting man. And it was fascinating because Laszlo approached me about 10 years ago to say, "You're the only person on the planet I want to write this book with," which I thought, wow, it's just
Wonderful. Yeah.
because Laszlo and I get each other. I get his model. And Laszlo, again, is arguing that, that the Akashic field, he calls it the Akashic field, is what's called 0 point energy. It's the 0 point field. And the 0 point field is an information field that contains everything. So when you're living your myriad of lives, when your Eidolon lives a single life, all that information is being drawn from the 0 point field. And the 0 point field is effectively the hard drive, the database, the information that backs the system.
I'd like to
And
say
then,
I'm very intrigued by everything you're saying here, and I'd like to, if I may, try to repackage this in a sense. I feel that this direction you've gone. I mean, I can imagine within the fields of like neurology, brain science, this is a very obviously highly contentious subject that you're getting into. And I certainly know that there are many, many high-level neurologists who would probably want to disagree with a lot of the things that you have said and argue.
They have tried in the past.
Absolutely. So, but
They
here's the
avoid
thing.
me like the plague.
Well, the reason that I side with you over them, even though I'm certainly not scientifically qualified, but I'm going to jump in, is because you are looking at a problem that I think they are not looking at. And the problem that, as I see it, that you're looking at is the fact that our reality, particularly when you get into things like space and time and causality, that there are things about our reality that cannot be explained in the standard materialistic paradigm. And it just doesn't. And I'll just tell you, I have looked at this myself at a much lower level of sophistication than you, but I've seen this as well. Just a few months ago, when you graciously participated in an event hosted by my wife, Tracy, an online event, one of our guests was Russell Targ, famed remote viewing scientist, and also Dale Graff, another one. And Dale and Patricia Cyrus, who is a colleague of Dale, all of them talked to us about retrocausality. And I don't want to derail our conversation here, but I will just say this concept blew my mind. And I fully believe in what they're talking about. This idea that it's more than just precognition. That's crazy enough. Precognition being you or I can see something that hasn't yet happened. Okay. But the other side of that, as I learned from these individuals, is of retrocausality, which is it's the future essentially coming in at you to give you that information. Mm. And I guess suffice to say that I thought their conception, their arguments of this were strong enough that it really, I don't have a problem going into these areas now that you are going into. Because I think you're onto something.
I think
fundamentally you're probably right, I guess is what I'm saying.
Just jump in there because it's quite important here when we're talking about retrocausality, is that people know that precognition happens, and as my logic is always, okay, I want to explain it. I don't want to just keep citing it happened to me analogy.
Well, you say people know, but the materialist neurologist will probably deny this all day long.
But they need to be careful here.
Yeah.
Because people like me, I hoist them on their own petard. Okay. Because, for instance, if there's any people out there who are thinking this guy's talking nonsense, what I'll do is I'll turn around to them and cite, okay, look at the work of Benjamin Libet and the intention to flex and the discovery that the human brain is already processing information up to 6 seconds in the future. Okay. We know from the work done by Dean Radin, when he was working, I think, with Russell Targ at the Pear Laboratories, they actually discovered, that people have short-term precognition. They measured the skin conductance of people's skin.
I've heard about this as well.
And when they were going to see potentially horrific pictures, and the skin conductance anticipated the picture they were going to see.
Yes, now, that's going to happen, right?
But nobody's really tried to explain this. And I've argued this is because everybody's silo thinking. I'm one of the few people in the world that's going, okay, let's look at quantum mechanics. Let's look at cosmology. And there's a guy called John Kramer, Professor John Kramer, who years ago came up with something called the transactional interpretation of quantum mechanics. And get this, Kramer argues, and he's a top physicist, but he's not talking to the neurologist or anything because they don't talk to each other. What they found is that waves can be going forwards in time, which I think are advanced waves, or going backwards in time, which are called retarded waves. And this is how it happens. Retarded waves are going back. I can never remember which one is which, so forgive me on that. But they're coming backwards in time, almost like tachyons, for want of a better term. And they're going backwards in time. And then these other waves are coming forward. And I think I'm the only person that said, hold on a minute. If there are waves coming backwards in time, and there are waves coming forward in time, and they hit each other, what do they cause? An interference pattern. This is what happens when you put waves together. You get what's called an interference pattern,
Okay.
a hologram. So I think this reality is created by information coming from the future into the past and from past to the future. I also argue together with Philip K. Dick, the idea that orthogonal time, there is a time that runs at right angles to this time. And again, this is all to do with physics. So the information is going backwards, but we can't necessarily pick it up. But I think under some circumstances, certain individuals can. But an even better explanation for precognition is even simpler. You know, I very much believe in Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is better.
Mm.
One of the most well-known psychic phenomenon that people have that science still cannot explain, even though it is claimed it has, is the deja vu experience. Okay. Now you read books on neurology, they will turn around and say, oh, Robert Efron in 1961 explained it. Utter rubbish. He didn't. He explained when you see things and the way they may repeat because information crossing the corpus callosum between the dominant and non-dominant hemispheres of the brain. But there was a guy called Akira O'Connor at the University of Leeds in 2017, I think it was, and they discovered that the blind people have a deja vu effect when they hear things and they hear them again. That cannot be explained using the visual pathways argument of Efron. Yeah. So suddenly it's gone. So I argue that deja vu is exactly what it feels. You're seeing the future. You've been this place before and you have lived this moment before. It's exactly what people say. And there's two forms of deja vu. There's the recognition scenario, which was put forward by Professor Werner Neppe, who's one of the world's leading experts in deja vu. He's up in Seattle, and he wrote a fascinating book on deja vu a few years ago. And Neppe argues that it's kind of we're seeing the future in some way, but it's also more interesting. It's an undefined sensation that you've experienced this sometime in your past. So the argument is that you are remembering something that has happened in your past that's yet to happen in your life now. And that's where my cheating the ferryman argument comes in, because I argue that we live our lives over and over again. And we are living in a simulation of our lives where we follow every track that we can possibly follow of our lives. We have in the database of every outcome of every decision is already programmed in, and you live your life and you make decisions every time, or your daemon makes you make a decision every time.
Couldn't it be that they're actually all being played out simultaneously in some manner that we can't really grasp?
Well, yes, because that's, again, the idea of serial time. And serial time was a concept that was first put up by a guy called J.W. Dunn in 1927, who wrote a book called An Experiment with Time, because he had a series of extraordinary precognitions that took place. For instance, his most famous one took place in 1903, when he was down in South Africa covering the Boer War for the British Army. He became an aeronautical engineer. And he had this incredibly vivid dream. And in the dream, he was living on a French-speaking Caribbean island. And the locals came to him and they said there's been a terrible disaster the other side of the island. 4,000 people have been killed. It's been a disaster. The volcano's gone up and people have been killed. He wakes up the next morning with 4,000 people in his mind and a volcano and a French-speaking Caribbean island. He waits for a few days and the newspapers come down from London and he picks up the Daily Telegraph 3 or 4 days later. On the night he had his dream, there was an eruption of Mount Pelée on the French-speaking island of Martinique. And as he read, 4,000 people had been killed. The whole main city of Saint-Pierre was wiped out. There was something called the Nuit Andante, which is a kind of glowing cloud of poisonous gas that came down, killed everybody. Wow. Didn't kill everybody. One guy survived, who was a prisoner, who was on death row, who was in a cell below ground level. He was the only person that survived.
Oh my God.
Even the people in the bay on boats were killed.
When did this happen? When was this?
1903.
Okay.
Now, but this is important. There's a caveat to this, because Dunn was convinced about the 4,000. And he then subsequently had kept a dream diary and his dreams consistently came true. But he was doing a talk sometime in the 1920s. And somebody came to him and he said, you know, you say about Mount Pelée and everything. And he said, yeah, you got it all right, but you got the number wrong. 40,000 people were killed, not 4,000. And he thought, whoa. So he went back to the original newspaper and he'd misread it. And he suddenly realized something profoundly important. He realized that his dream had not been created because he was being precognitive. Well, he was, but his dream was being created by him remembering reading
His
the
own
newspaper account,
personal subjective experience
own personal
of that life.
subjective experience. And suddenly he said, which means that we all have our own serial times. And he argued that, and it's so clever, his argument. His argument is, how do we know that time passes? In other words, when we see a river flowing, as Marcus Aurelius said, time is like a river, but you know a river is flowing because there's riverbanks. So you have something that is static that the river
Sure.
flows. But if you took the riverbanks away and there was only just the river, you wouldn't know the river was moving. And
Right.
he argues that's the same as time, because time is the only thing we measure by itself. So we can never, how do we know a minute has passed? A minute has passed what? You know, we use the term a minute has passed, but we don't know what it's passed. So then he argues this is because there's more than one type of time. There are serial times, and each time is measured by the other time. So in other words, time two measures time one. So normal time is measured against time two, and time two is measured against time three. But he then argued something fascinating. He said, not only that, but there is a version of you in each of these times. And that version of you has a broader perception of the present moment. And that person can feed information down to you. He said the analogy is like a man on a train. You know, if you're in the compartment looking out the window, you just see the things passing, the platform passing. But if somebody's on the roof of the train and can see in the front, and the railway line's going in the front and the back, his perception of time is completely different. And he argues that there are levels of us in different times. Now, I've taken that idea and made it more scientific and more valid, because I argue that effectively the inhabitant of time two is the Daemon, and the inhabitant of time one is the Eidolon.
You explained the Eidolon again is the greater Daemon, right? The Eidolon is
the Eidolon is the
the
person.
oversoul, perhaps something like that.
No, the opposite. The opposite. The Eidolon
Sorry.
is your game is lives one life. It only lives one life and it dies.
Oh, like the Avatar, essentially.
Like an avatar. Yeah, like an avatar. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So Eidolon. We are all Eidolons. We all perceive the world as Eidolons. Yeah. But some of us, people have temporal lobe epilepsy, people have various other neurological conditions, they perceive the world slightly differently because they can tune into the demonic consciousness, which is the consciousness of observer two or the daemon. And it's in those circumstances that they become precognitive, because they suddenly attune into the knowledge fields of their daemon. Now, a daemon then can attune into the knowledge fields of the uber daemon, which is the thing that has all experiences that humanity can have. Yeah. And then I ended up by saying, and then something called the Godemon. And the Godemon is the Or Ein Sof, it's Brahman, it's everything. It is what is everything, which is what in the Kabbalah they say. The Or Ein Sof, it's everything.
I'm fascinated.
I'm fascinated by pure Gnosticism.
Yeah. It seems to me what your work is doing is I think you're constructing, I don't want to say constructing, that almost sounds, you're seeing an organization of reality that has explanatory power over some of these very, very fringe and otherwise impossible to explain types of things that go on in our world. That's what it seems to me that you're really all about.
I would argue that my hypothesis can explain every single extraordinary experience that human beings have.
That's what I gather. My brain broke a few times in the process of you explaining, but I think I'm hanging in there with you. And I have to just say, Anthony, this is absolutely fascinating. And we can keep going. I mean, normally I try to do these for roughly an hour, but depending on how much gas you got left in the tank, I'm quite interested in a few of these areas that you're going. Before we do close up here, are you able to incorporate a concept of, well, I guess what we call aliens or UFOs or this type of concept? I know that's not your number one area of research, but I know you've talked about it and you've gone in that direction. And because a lot of my audience is interested in that, and I thought it might be interesting to hear what you have to say, your perspective about that.
Okay, well, a little bit of history in that my initial interest in everything to do with my research now was stimulated by my interest in UFOs. I started as a kid of 10 or 11 fascinated by UFOs. And my initial knowledge and worldview, I used to read Flying Saucer Review and everything else as well. And I was also interested in ghosts and things like that.
Sure.
But I was interested in it, trying to explain it. So UFOs, I know a good deal. I know quite a lot about UFOs and the history of UFOs and the background to UFOs. And I would argue that UFOs are central to this. And what we would consider to be the other is also central to this. And I'm very much in the school of people like John Keel and Jacques Vallée on this, in that I genuinely believe that the phenomenon is as much psychological as it is physical. But I readily agree that there's physical evidence of these things. But there seems to be something psychological taking place as well. And I believe that in some way the aliens we encounter are exactly the same entities that people have encountered for millennia, in terms of the Fae, the little people. And I know I'm not original on this. I know Valley and Passport to Magonia, and I know the arguments, but I'm trying to pull it together now, bringing it in to DMT entities, because the similarities between DMT entities and alien abduction entities is very, very similar, as is near-death experiences. In my new book, I have whole sections where literally people are describing near-death experiences that are alien abductions, literally. And of course, you can then extrapolate from that to shamanism and the idea of the shamanic journey and the way in which people, when they go on shamanic journey and get dismembered by entities, it's exactly the same phenomenon. It's just people are coming at it from different angles. And I'd like to feel all the time that because I'm a very eclectic thinker, I'm taking something from there, something from there, something from there, something from there, and bringing it together as something big.
I hear what you're saying with a lot of this, but I'm not fully on board with that argument. I think of cases of famous abduction cases. Travis Walton.
Yes.
Travis Walton, he's with 6 other colleagues. They've just finished a day of logging. It's 1975. They all see a craft. Travis gets out of the car. He walks toward this thing, gets hit with a beam of light. We all know the story. His friends think he's dead. They take off. Then they come back. He's gone for 5 days and all of that saga. And he has a memory. Now, to me, that strikes me as a very physical event. There are many such abduction cases that strike me as entirely physical, where there's an actual physical being that comes in somehow into our reality, takes a person, plays around with their genetics, creates hybrids, all of that. I think that that's part of the story. That doesn't mean that I want to dismiss this other concept.
Okay. I'll jump in there and I'll say I'm totally with you on that, and I can see it's very much the European ufology thing to the American nuts and bolts.
That's right. That's right.
But there's a counter argument to this, which is my logical mind, and my logical mind says to me, how many people do they need to abduct in order to find out what they're trying to find out? Now, don't you think it's fascinating that in the 1950s, we now have fMRI scanners. We have things that can scan through the body and everything else, but the aliens don't. The aliens are still cutting people open. Why? It makes no sense. If
technology seems a little behind the times today.
Yes, and it's behind the times for an obvious reason, because it is a social construct. But it doesn't mean that it is necessarily a social construct in the idea of a fiction. It's a social construct in the sense that we collectively create the reality we live within. So therefore, we populate that reality with our anticipations of what things are going to be. Because it always seems that the UFOs back from the 1890s flaps, where we had the airships, they culturally track, but they're always just like slightly ahead of us. They're slightly ahead of what we understand the world to be.
I'm actually not a believer in the airship mystery. This makes me a bit of an outlier among UFO researchers, but I no longer credit those sightings. But that's just me. I
Okay.
actually, I do believe in a lot of ancient UFO sightings. Don't get me wrong. Uh, just no longer the airships. I'm
Yeah,
not.
I mean, I mean, for instance, I always found it quite strange. You know, they have the hook comes down and they speak with German accents and things.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
clearly, it's a social construct of one way or another. Then we had the Space Brothers, you know, in the
Sure.
1950s, and we had the embarrassing things like, you know, when prophecy fails, the Festinger incidents, you know, and clearly,
Exactly.
again, it's sociological because by background I'm a sociologist. I'm a sociologist by training, and particularly sociology of belief. So it's intriguing here, but I think there's a kind of a feedback mechanism going on, and that's where the mystery lies, and that's where the fascination lies.
Well, I'm with you on that. There is a definite, the whole psychosocial school of ufology, which is very strong in Britain and Europe. Like there's a lot of power to that, and it is. I certainly wouldn't argue against it all the time. So, but not all of it sits right with me, but some of it does, and
Well,
it's
you'll know,
it's a
won't
messy,
you?
complicated subject.
I mean, you know, because you know there's so much physical evidence.
Yeah,
You can't deny the physical evidence
that's
that
the
is,
thing.
you
That's
know,
the
and
thing.
I'd be fascinated. I'm really looking forward to meeting Travis, when we do
Oh,
contact,
he's fascinating. Travis, I've known him for many years, and he's
and Whitley as well, you know,
yeah, yeah.
and really, you know, there is something intriguing.
You were talking about something that sometimes was called the liminal reality by I think Kenneth Ring was the scientist who talked about these liminal states, and it sounds a little bit like along those lines. But let me just give you the opportunity to continue and finish your train of thought on this.
Yeah, no, very much. I'm a huge admirer of Kenneth Ring.
I say, yeah.
I think his work with the Omega Project was
It's
just
fascinating. I read Kenneth Ring, first when I started researching UFOs about 30 years ago, and I was much less enamored of his concept of the liminal reality. But as time has gone by, I've really come to understand and appreciate what he's had to say about that. So it's
Well, I
very
think
nice to.
again, you know, it's there's nothing new on the earth, I know, but there was a guy called Henri Corbin, who was a French philosopher in I think the 1930s, 1940s, and he came up with the term the mundus imaginalis.
Hmm.
And it's the same kind of concept. I mean, he was a French Sufi thinker, and again, the argument, you know, that there is this kind of liminal world, that overlaps between this reality and whatever the other reality is. And again, in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, I have a whole section on the liminality
Yeah, and
and the
it's
way.
not imaginary; it's real. That's the thing
No,
about
but
it.
no, but that's the thing. But Corbyn was being quite precise here.
Yeah.
He called it mundus imaginalis, not in the usage of English imaginary. It's more imaginary, as in the concept mathematically of imaginary numbers. You know, it's something that is part of the imagination,
Hmm.
but it doesn't mean it's like, I'd argue, for instance, that you know you could argue that something is a hallucination, but of course nobody knows what hallucinations are. Again, if anybody, you know, this is one of the things that neurologists, you know, with a hubris turn around and say, well, you know, it's just an hallucination. When of course that terminology means nothing. Hallucination, by definition, is just that you've experienced something and nobody else has. But when two people share an hallucination, it's a folly of
Hmm.
dirt. So they got a nice little for it then. So you've got to be very, very careful here because nobody knows. I mean, for instance, the great Oliver Sacks, the psychiatrist, his last book was called Hallucinations. And in this, he had a whole section on we don't know how the brain projects into the external world an hallucination, you know, because it's projected out from inside the brain into the scenario, your visual field and your auditory field, which means it's been stimulated by something. So when we say we're having an hallucination of, say, a UFO in the sky,
Hmm.
but that's been stimulated by something, it's been created by something,
Right.
which means it's just as real because it's using your sensory capacities to model the external world and it imposes that on the external world.
Sure. Sure.
You
Sure.
know, for instance, I was saying to you before we started, it was fascinating. I did an event in Southend here in the UK 3 weekends ago, and there was a lady there who brought to me a video she'd made a few days previously looking out of her apartment over the sea. And she said, so can you see those things? And there were objects flying in a line, and then they started moving around. And then she said, I bet you think they are lights reflected on the glass. And I said, well, they look like they could be. And she said, and then she opens the window and you can still see them. And you can see them moving. And then they move behind the clouds. So they were things that were physically being filmed.
Yeah,
But she said the terrifying thing was she was standing there with her friend, and her friend couldn't see them, even though they showed on her camera,
right.
which means how much are we co-creating this reality that other people can't see things? You know,
The UFO phenomenon has many examples of this, where you have two people standing together. One person can see this thing very clearly, the other person does not, and it's weird. It's been recorded many times.
So there's something more here
Yeah,
than meets the eye. And I think, again, I keep using the idea of like waves on the sea. We're all looking at the tops of the waves and trying to come to conclusions. But in fact, there's this sea underneath where all the information is there. And I genuinely believe that people like you and I and other people in this field, we'll get together one day and we'll sort it out. It'll click. All the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle will fit. And we'll go, how did we not see it? And then
I
the universe.
feel I feel that you've gone a long, long way toward conceptualizing something that I think is very coherent, honestly. And uh, you know, I struggle sometimes to keep up with you. I mean, some of these ideas that you're throwing out there, but I think that they're fascinating, and it seems to me that it's making a lot of sense.
Thank you.
I'm just to me, what's exciting is like we're on this journey of our lives. And those of us who are trying to engage in this question of what is this reality within which we find ourselves? I mean, fundamentally, to me, that's really what you're asking. What is this? And uh, I just appreciate the fact that you're trying to explore very difficult, these difficult to explain fringe phenomena in a way that I think kind of makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. And at my very low level of scientific qualification, but I very much appreciate it. I've felt, I know we're going to wrap this up here, but the further I go down this little road of life, the more I tend to feel that there is this thing called destiny and fate. And it doesn't mean that I don't believe in free will. Um, I'm not saying there's no free will, but I have come to feel that this a whole concept of time and causality that we tend to experience it is far, far greater. And I do think that there's this grand, like that it's all been done. It's all done. We're living through a process that in a sense, it's already been done. And I don't have it. That's not a good way to explain it, but
I think you did very
that's what I
well.
think. That is what I think.
I think you did very well. I mean, I would just very quickly say my overall life philosophy is I need to understand. I do this because I want to understand what's going on. And if other
Yeah,
people are interested in reading my books and share my enthusiasm, that's great. But it's me, Anthony Peake, and my search.
totally. It's like, what is more interesting for someone who actually cares than to ask questions like this? Like there's really nothing more fun. There's nothing more interesting. There's nothing more engaging uh, to some of us, I think, than to ask questions like this. And you've really gone so far down this road. I will definitely have links for people to check out your webpage, which is anthonypeake.com. And I know you're very active on Facebook. I will have a link for that. Are there any other ways that you are happy to have people reach you?
Yeah, Instagram, and I also have my own YouTube channel, which is slightly in abeyance at the moment, but you just search on YouTube Anthony Peake. I've interviewed a lot of very, very interesting people. There's around about 120, 130 interviews on there,
Oh, indeed.
including
Oh,
really big
sorry to cut you
research,
off.
that are really pushing the envelope in various ways.
We'll have links for all of those because I am convinced that your work is of great interest and a very important part of the overall conversation of what our reality is. There's so many more things I know that we can talk about, Anthony. I will just mention to folks that you, me, Tracy and a lot of other people will be at Contact in the Desert in about a week and a half from now. And that's actually not why we're doing this. We're just doing this because I have wanted to have you on this program for quite some time. But we all will be at Contact in the Desert. So anyone watching this, if you get yourself out there at the very end of May and early June, go find Anthony, go find myself and Tracy. We'll all be there. Anthony, I know you'll be delivering, you said 4 lectures? 4.
I'm doing Physics 101 on the Thursday. Then I'm doing a lecture, a workshop, and an intensive.
Good grief. I'm doing 3 and I thought I was overworked.
Plus the
Plus a bunch
panel.
of panels.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so be it. You know, I thoroughly enjoyed last year, and I think it's going to be even better this year because we all know each other that bit better. You know, it's just going to be great. Absolutely.
Well, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to have in terms of final words.
No, all I can say is that for anybody that's intrigued by my work, don't take anything I say for granted. My overall philosophy is extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. And that's what I work on. So therefore, all my books, every single thing I say is referenced back to academic papers. Read the academic papers yourself, come to your own conclusions. If I'm wrong, tell me, let me know, and I will adapt and change, because ultimately truth is truth. And that's what's important to me, nothing else.
Strongly appreciate that sentiment. It's been a real pleasure, Anthony. I've really just enjoyed it. I believe that viewers of this channel will also feel the same way. I have a very strong feeling, and perhaps we can do this again if you're free in the future.
Absolutely.
I think you'd be very happy to. Well, I want to thank everyone who's been on this journey with Anthony Peake and myself. You know, if you like this video, please hit the like button. Select notifications so you don't miss future editions of The Richard Dolan Show. Subscribe to my channel. It doesn't cost anything. It does definitely help me out. And if you genuinely support what I do, go to my website, richarddolanmembers.com, where I have a lot of material there. Some of it's for members. Some of it's just wide open to the public. Do feel free to check it out. I'm very active there. Anthony Peake, it's been a genuine pleasure. And thank you again. And to all the folks here, thank you for being here with us. I'll catch you again soon. Let's all keep fighting the good fight. Later.